In a Supreme Court showdown, Justice Amy Coney Barrett locks horns with AG Pam Bondi, threatening jail. But Bondi's legal brilliance turns the tables in a fiery clash of wits. The courtroom buzzed with tension, air thick with anticipation, as the mahogany-paneled chamber of the United States Supreme Court filled with spectators, reporters, and legal scholars. At the center of this storm stood Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, her sharp eyes scanning the room, her posture unyielding. Across from her, on the elevated bench, Justice Amy Coney Barrett adjusted her glasses, her expression a mask of steely resolve. The case before them was explosive. A constitutional challenge to a federal statute Bondi had fiercely defended, one that critics claimed overstepped executive authority. Barrett, known for her strict textualist approach, had signaled skepticism, and whispers of contempt loomed if Bondi pushed too far. Bondi stepped to the podium, her voice steady but laced with defiance. "The government's position is clear," she began. "This statute is a lawful exercise of congressional power, rooted in precedent and necessity." Her words were a gauntlet thrown down, a direct challenge to Barrett's anticipated dissent. The justice leaned forward, her pen pausing mid-note. "Counselor," Barrett interjected, her tone icy, "you tread dangerously close to disregarding this court's authority. Your argument seems to assume we'll bend to expediency over principle." The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging heavy. Bondi's jaw tightened, but she didn't flinch. "With respect, Justice Barrett, I assume only that this court values the Constitution's text as much as I do." The exchange set the stage for a battle not just of law, but of wills. Barrett, a jurist revered for her intellectual rigor, had built a reputation for dismantling weak arguments with surgical precision. Bondi, a former prosecutor turned political powerhouse, was no stranger to high-stakes confrontations. Her tenure as Florida's Attorney General had honed her ability to navigate legal and political minefields. But this was different. The Supreme Court was the ultimate arena, and Barrett's questioning suggested she was prepared to hold Bondi in contempt if her advocacy crossed into defiance. As Bondi pressed her case, citing obscure 19th-century precedents and weaving a narrative of congressional intent, Barrett's interruptions grew sharper. "You're asking us to rewrite history, Ms. Bondi," Barrett said, her voice cutting through the chamber. "This court doesn't indulge creative fiction." The gallery murmured, sensing blood in the water. Bondi's team, seated behind her, exchanged nervous glances. The threat of jail for contempt wasn't explicit, but Barrett's tone and the court's history made it a real possibility. A misstep could end Bondi's career, yet Bondi didn't retreat. She pivoted, her argument shifting to a detailed dissection of the statute's language, her words precise, her logic relentless. She quoted Barrett's own judicial opinions back to her, a bold move that drew gasps from the audience. "As you wrote in 2022, Justice Barrett, text must govern over intent when clarity exists. This statute is clear." Barrett's eyes narrowed, but a flicker of something, respect perhaps, crossed her face. The other justices, silent until now, began to engage, their questions probing but less hostile. Bondi was gaining ground, but the tension remained palpable. The session stretched into hours, each moment a tightrope walk. Barrett's scrutiny never wavered, her questions laced with a challenge. "Prove your case or face the consequences." Bondi met her gaze, unflinching, her responses growing sharper, her confidence almost daring. Spectators leaned forward, sensing a historic clash unfolding. Then, as Bondi concluded her argument, Barrett leaned back, her expression unreadable. "We'll recess," she announced, her voice betraying nothing. The gavel fell, and the room exhaled. Bondi turned to her team, her face a mask of determination, but her eyes burned with something fierce. The battle was far from over, and Barrett's next move could change everything. The Supreme Court chamber emptied slowly, the echo of the gavel lingering like a warning. Pam Bondi stood at the council table, her hands steady as she gathered her notes, but her mind raced. Justice Amy Coney Barrett's parting words during the recess, "Counselor, I trust you'll refine your approach," had carried an edge that felt personal. The threat of contempt still hung in the air, a silent blade over Bondi's every move. Her team huddled close, their whispers urgent, but Bondi's focus was elsewhere. She could feel Barrett's gaze, even now, as if the justice were still, dissecting her from the bench. The recess was no reprieve. It was a battlefield of its own. In the marble-lined hallway outside, reporters swarmed, their cameras flashing as Bondi emerged. "General Bondi, is Justice Barrett targeting you?" one shouted. She offered a tight smile, deflecting with practiced ease. "The court is doing its job, and so am I." But inside, doubt gnawed at her. Barrett's reputation for intellectual dominance was unmatched, and her textualist philosophy left little room for the pragmatic arguments Bondi had wielded. The justice's earlier interruptions had exposed cracks in Bondi's strategy, and the recess felt like a chance for Barrett to sharpen her next assault. Back in the courtroom, as the session resumed, the atmosphere was electric. Spectators packed, the pews, their murmurs hushed as Barrett took her seat, her expression a study in restraint. Bondi returned to the podium, her posture defiant, but her opening words carried a new weight. "If I may, Justice Barrett, I'd like to address your concern about historical fidelity." It was a bold move, confronting the justice's earlier rebuke head-on. Barrett's brow arched slightly, a signal of interest or warning. Bondi couldn't tell. "Proceed," Barrett said, her voice cool but expectant. Bondi launched into a meticulous analysis, weaving together constitutional history, statutory text, and the obscure 1803 case that even the justices seemed unfamiliar with. Her voice was steady, but each word was a calculated strike, aimed at dismantling Barrett's skepticism. The justice listened, her pen moving swiftly, but her silence was unnerving. Then, abruptly, she interjected. "Ms. Bondi, you're sidestepping the core issue, this statute's overreach. Are you arguing Congress can act without limits?" The question was a trap, and the room held its breath. Bondi paused, her eyes locked on Barrett's. "No, Justice, I'm arguing Congress acted within its enumerated powers, as this court has upheld for centuries." The exchange ignited a flurry of questions from the other justices, some probing, others openly skeptical. Justice Kagan leaned forward, her tone sharp. "You're asking us to trust Congress's intent over clear textual limits. That's a hard sell," Bondi countered with a deft pivot, citing Barrett's own writings on judicial restraint. As Justice Barrett has noted, courts must respect the democratic process when the text permits it. The move was audacious, turning Barrett's philosophy against her, and a ripple of surprise passed through the gallery. Barrett's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't interrupt. As the hours wore on, the confrontation grew more intense. Barrett's questions became relentless, each one a scalpel probing for weakness. "You're relying on precedent, Ms. Bondi, but what if this court reconsiders?" she asked, her tone almost daring Bondi to falter. The implication was clear. Barrett was prepared to upend settled law to challenge Bondi's case. The Attorney General didn't blink. "Then I trust this court will do so with the rigor it demands, and I'll meet that challenge here." The boldness of her response drew murmurs from the audience, and even Justice Alito, usually reserved, nodded slightly. The session neared its close, and Bondi's arguments had gained traction, but Barrett remained an enigma. As Bondi delivered her final points, the justice leaned forward, her voice low but piercing. "You've made your case, Ms. Bondi, but conviction doesn't equal correctness. We'll see if your logic holds." The words landed like a gauntlet, and the gavel's crack sealed the moment. Bondi stepped back, her face calm but her pulse racing. The courtroom buzzed with speculation. Had she swayed the court, or had Barrett set a trap for the next round? The Supreme Court chamber pulsed with restless energy as the gavel's echo faded. Pam Bondi stood at the counsel table, her composure a thin veneer over the storm within. Justice Amy Coney Barrett's parting words, "Conviction doesn't equal correctness," had sliced through the room, a challenge that lingered like smoke. The spectators' whispers grew louder, their eyes darting between Bondi and the bench where Barrett sat, her gaze fixed on some distant point, her thoughts impenetrable. The Attorney General knew the next session could tip the scales. Barrett's scrutiny was unrelenting, and the specter of contempt still loomed, a silent threat to her freedom and reputation. As the court reconvened, the air felt heavier, charged, with the weight of what was at stake. Bondi's team had spent the break dissecting Barrett's questions, searching for a path through the justice's textualist fortress. They'd found a sliver of hope in an overlooked clause of the statute, but it was a gamble. Bondi took the podium, her voice steady but laced with a quiet intensity. The government submits that the statute's plain text, particularly its limiting clause, resolves any constitutional concerns. She paused, letting the words settle, her eyes meeting Barrett's. The justice's pen stopped, her head tilting slightly, a signal she was listening, but not yet convinced. Barrett wasted no time. "Ms. Bondi, you're hanging your entire case on a single clause, one that's ambiguous at best. Do you expect this court to ignore the broader implications?" Her tone was measured, but the question was a blade, sharp and precise. Bondi didn't hesitate. "With respect, Justice Barrett, the clause isn't ambiguous when read in context. It's a deliberate limit, as this court's own precedents confirm." She cited a 1978 case, her delivery flawless, but Barrett's expression remained unyielding. "Precedent isn't a shield when the text fails," the justice shot back, her voice rising slightly. The gallery tensed, sensing the clash escalating. The other justices joined the fray, their questions a barrage. Justice Gorsuch pressed Bondi on congressional overreach, while Justice Sotomayor challenged the statute's practical impact. Bondi navigated each with precision, her responses a blend of legal scholarship and raw determination. But Barrett was the true adversary, her interruptions growing more pointed. "You're asking us to trust a reading that strains credulity," she said, her eyes locked on Bondi's. "If we reject your interpretation, what then?" The question wasn't just legal, it was personal, a test of Bondi's resolve. The Attorney General leaned forward, her voice firm. "Then I trust this court to articulate a clear standard, and I'll defend the law within it." The boldness drew a ripple of gasps from the audience. Bondi was walking a razor's edge, her defiance risking Barrett's wrath. The justice leaned back, her fingers tapping her pen, a rare sign of agitation. "You're confident, Ms. Bondi," she said, her voice low. "But confidence can blind." The words were a warning, and the room felt smaller, the stakes higher. Bondi pressed on, unraveling the statute's legislative history with a clarity that silenced even the skeptics. She quoted a forgotten congressional debate, her argument weaving a narrative that made the clause's purpose undeniable. Even Justice Kagan, usually reserved, nodded faintly. But Barrett wasn't swayed. As Bondi built her case, the justice interjected again, her tone colder. "You're crafting a story, not a legal argument. This court deals in facts." The rebuke stung, and Bondi's team exchanged worried glances. Yet Bondi didn't falter. She shifted tactics, dissecting the statute's grammar with a linguist's precision, her words a direct challenge to Barrett's textualism. "The text is the fact, Justice Barrett, and it speaks for itself." The room held its breath, the audacity of her response hanging in the air. As the session drew to a close, the tension was palpable. Bondi's arguments had won allies among the justices, but Barrett remained a wall, her questions unrelenting. "We'll see if your text holds up under scrutiny," she said, her voice a quiet storm. The gavel fell, and the courtroom erupted, in murmurs. Bondi stepped back, her face a mask of resolve, but her heart pounded. Barrett's next move could unravel everything, and the final round loomed like a gathering storm. The Supreme Court chamber vibrated with unspoken tension as the murmurs faded, the gavel's echo a stark reminder of the battle unfinished. Pam Bondi stood at the counsel table, her hands steady but her mind racing, replaying Justice Amy Coney Barrett's final words. "We'll see if your text holds up under scrutiny." The justice's voice, calm yet piercing, had carried a weight that chilled the room. Barrett's unyielding skepticism was a fortress, and the threat of contempt still shadowed Bondi's every step. The Attorney General's resolve was iron, but doubt flickered. Could she break through Barrett's wall in the final session, or would the justice's next move crush her case? As the court reconvened, the air crackled with anticipation. Spectators leaned forward, their eyes fixed on Bondi as she approached the podium, her posture radiating defiance. Barrett sat at the bench, her expression a mask of cool authority, her pen poised like a weapon. Bondi opened with a calculated shift, addressing the justice directly. "Justice Barrett, your concern about textual limits is well taken. I submit that the statute's structure, when read holistically, resolves any ambiguity." Her voice was steady, but the words were a gauntlet, daring Barrett to engage. The justice's eyes narrowed, a faint spark of intrigue betraying her stoic facade. "Holistic readings can obscure truth, Ms. Bondi," Barrett replied, her tone sharp. "Convince me." The challenge ignited the room. Bondi dove into a surgical analysis, dissecting the statute's syntax with a precision that bordered on artistry. She cited a 19th-century grammar treatise, aligning it with Barrett's own textualist principles, her argument a masterclass in legal reasoning. The gallery was riveted, and even Justice Thomas, typically silent, leaned forward. But Barrett was relentless, her interruptions cutting like a blade. "You're relying on external sources to prop up a weak text," she said, her voice rising. "This court doesn't indulge in such gymnastics." The rebuke drew gasps, and Bondi's team tensed, sensing the contempt threat looming closer. Bondi didn't flinch. "With respect, Justice Barrett, the text itself invites this reading, as your own opinions have affirmed." She quoted a 2021 Barrett dissent, a bold move that stunned the room. The justice's pen paused, her lips pressing into a thin line. The other justices seized the moment, their questions a rapid-fire barrage. Justice Roberts probed the statute's practical limits, while Justice Breyer challenged its historical roots. Bondi parried each with ease, her responses weaving a tapestry of law and logic that began to sway the bench. Even Kagan, a skeptic, seemed to soften, her nod subtle but telling. Yet Barrett remained unmoved, her scrutiny a storm-gathering force. "You're asking us to rewrite the Constitution's boundaries," she said, her voice low but venomous. "That's a dangerous precedent, Ms. Bondi." The words were a direct challenge, and the room held its breath. Bondi leaned forward, her eyes locked on Barrett's. "I'm asking this court to uphold the Constitution's text, as you've championed, Justice. The statute fits within it." The audacity of her response sent a ripple through the audience, and Barrett's fingers tightened around her pen, a rare crack in her composure. As the session stretched on, the clash grew fiercer. Bondi unveiled a new angle, citing a forgotten congressional record that clarified the statute's intent. Her delivery a blend of passion and precision. The move caught the justices off guard, and even Barrett's questions slowed, her tone less hostile. But the justice wasn't done. "You've built a compelling case, Ms. Bondi," she said, her voice deceptively soft. "But compelling isn't correct. What if we find your reading flawed?" The question was a trap, and Bondi's pulse quickened. "Then I trust this court's wisdom to guide the law forward," she replied, her voice unwavering. The session neared its end, and the courtroom buzzed with tension. Bondi's arguments had shifted the tide, but Barrett's final words loomed, large. "We'll deliberate," she said, her gaze piercing Bondi. "Your fate, and this statute's, rests with us." The gavel fell, and the room exhaled, but Bondi stood frozen, her mind racing. The final reckoning was coming, and Barrett's decision could rewrite history. The Supreme Court chamber felt like a pressure cooker, the air thick with the weight of Justice Amy Coney Barrett's final words. "Your fate, and this statute's, rests with us." Pam Bondi stood at the council table, her face a mask of resolve, but her heart thundered. The gavel's crack had signaled the end of arguments, but the real battle, deliberation, loomed. Barrett's piercing gaze had left no doubt. The justice held Bondi's career and the case's outcome in her hands. The threat of contempt, though unspoken now, still lingered, a shadow over Bondi's defiance. As spectators spilled into the halls, their whispers fevered, Bondi's team huddled close, their faces etched with worry. The Attorney General's mind churned. Had her bold strategy swayed the court, or had she pushed Barrett too far? Days passed. In a blur of anticipation, the nation gripped by the case's stakes. Bondi secluded herself in her office, poring over her arguments, second-guessing every word. Her team scoured legal blogs, where pundits debated whether Barrett's textualism would doom the statute or if Bondi's relentless logic had cracked the justice's armor. The wait was agonizing, each hour stretching the tension tighter. Then, the court announced its decision would come that morning. Bondi arrived at the chamber, her suit impeccable, her expression steely. Reporters swarmed, but she brushed past, her focus singular. Inside, the room was packed, the air electric with expectation. The justices filed in, their black robes a solemn contrast to the charged atmosphere. Barrett took her seat, her face unreadable, her pen idle for the first time. Chief Justice Roberts began, his voice steady, but all eyes were on Barrett. "The opinion of the court," he said, "is delivered by Justice Barrett." Bondi's breath caught, her pulse a drumbeat. Barrett adjusted her glasses, her gaze sweeping the room before settling on Bondi. "This case tests the boundaries of congressional power," she began, her voice clear and deliberate. "The government, through Ms. Bondi, defends a statute we find deeply contested." The room tensed, and Bondi braced herself. Barrett's tone was measured, but her words carried an edge. Ms. Bondi's arguments leaned heavily on a single clause, a reading we initially found strained. The words landed like a blow, and Bondi's team exchanged grim glances. Barrett continued, dissecting the statute's text with surgical precision, her analysis echoing the skepticism she'd wielded in court. "Yet," she said, pausing, "the government's reliance on historical context, particularly in 1803, precedent, demands closer scrutiny." Bondi's heart leapt. Had her gamble paid off? Barrett's opinion unfolded, a masterclass in textualist reasoning. She acknowledged Bondi's use of her own writings, a nod that drew murmurs from the gallery. The Attorney General's interpretation, while bold, aligns with the statute's plain meaning when viewed through its limiting clause. The room stirred, and Bondi's eyes widened. Barrett was siding with her. "This court finds the statute constitutional," Barrett declared, her voice firm. "Congress acted within its powers, and Ms. Bondi's advocacy illuminated this truth." The gallery erupted, a wave of gasps and whispers. Bondi exhaled, her shoulders easing for the first time in weeks. But Barrett wasn't finished. "Let me be clear," she said, her gaze locking onto Bondi. "This court does not reward defiance, but it respects rigor." Ms. Bondi walked a fine line, and her scholarship prevailed. The words were both praise and warning, a recognition of Bondi's brilliance and a reminder of the contempt threat she'd dodged. The gavel fell, sealing the victory. Bondi's team surged forward, their relief palpable, but she remained still, processing the triumph. Barrett had tested her, pushed her to the brink, and Bondi had emerged not just unscathed, but triumphant. As the chamber emptied, Bondi stepped into the sunlight, reporters shouting questions. She offered a rare smile. "The Constitution won today," she said, her voice steady. Inside she knew the truth. She'd faced Barrett's fire and proven her mettle. The legal world would remember this clash, not as a showdown, but as the moment Pam Bondi's genius reshaped the court's legacy.